Let us pray. Father, have mercy upon our deceased confreres who have gone before us in the sign of faith. May the Eucharist and the prayers we offered for them be to them a source of refreshment, life, and peace. Through Christ our Lord. If beautiful and impressive was the holy hour last night, I promise you are in for a treat, another spiritual treat, tonight at the healing prayer service. Frankly, I had some misgivings last week about this service. I never attended one before, except what I saw on Palm Sunday at Houston, Texas. Two of the Holy Shroud scientists and myself were to make a presentation to an unbelievably large crowd, 10,000 people, in a place in the round, with 4 great screens on each side. But what came before was a prayer service. Evidently, this was a group that was tuned to this particular type of service. And what I saw was almost unbelievable. These very sincere, I'm sure, Protestant ministers, the energy, the shouting, incredible how they would pray on individuals. I told one of them after it got through, you must be exhausted. It was the most dramatic performance I ever saw at any one service in my life. I did not have such thoughts about our prayer service last week, but somehow it isn't anything that really has appealed to me. I forced myself to attend it. And I can assure you I will want to do it again tonight. It was a faith experience that I would not like to miss. It really did me good. Tomorrow we will place the Eucharist on the forefront of our thoughts. When we think of it, it is, or should be, the most consoling reality in our everyday life. The Lord's gift of himself to his church and to us, to each of us. So we will begin with the Eucharistic assembly and the votive Mass of the Eucharist. Let's try to make it particularly devout and solemn. And through the day we will try to live with more than customary awareness the presence of Jesus in our midst, his Eucharistic presence. Our personal visit to the Blessed Sacrament should find us in a reflective, self-examining mood. Why is it that we are so little moved with regard to this mystery of love? And now shamelessly, I must tell you, shamelessly, showing all humility aside, I must tell you that I was pleased. The 3 confreres today told me not to be overly concerned if I passed the 35 or 40 minutes in my talks. And one of them told me, forget the clock. But I have a feeling haunting me that maybe some of you might end up saying what a delightful character of a confrere once said about the retreat he made. The meals were excellent, the room comfortable, but as for the sermons, the deepest impression on me was left by the bench. Well, thank goodness we have padded seats here. So, well, it used to be a tradition, and probably still is, that the students at the Gregorian University who graduate summa cum laude be received at a special audience by the Holy Father. There were 5 of them in 1906, 4 Jesuits and 1 Salesian, a cleric. His name, Paolo Ubaldi. Now, right before the visit, they reported to a room in the Vatican to pick up the ferraiolo, a long black cloak, which was required in those days for ecclesiastics who were received by the Pope at a special audience. We let Don Ubaldi tell the story. When the Monsignor in charge came, we were in the wardrobe where these ferraiolos, these things were available. He took a look at me and then he said, "You must be the Salesian among the 5. "Yes, Monsignor." "I can tell you who are," he said. "You must have just arrived from Patagonia. You look like a gaucho." I could not for me understand what he meant. After all, I was average height, as thin as a toothpick, with blondish hair, and on that day well shaven. "I don't understand, Monsignor," I said. "Just look at that cassock," he said. "Half a meter too short, faded and patched, with 10 buttons missing. And those shoes, yes, those shoes can only come from the Pampas." He took me by the arm, led me to another room. "Take off that cassock," he told me. "You'll wear one of those," and pointed to a number of cassocks hanging on a rack. If ever a cassock covered a multitude of sins, it was the one I was wearing. I had no choice but take it off. Monsignor took a look at me minus the cassock. "Were the Pope to see what I see," he said, "he would immediately order a worldwide collection for the Salesian congregation." Well, the Monsignor smiled. "Don't mind what I say," he told about me. "You people, Salesians, will go a lot farther than those sleek Jesuits." Don Ubaldi told the story at a retreat. He'll come into the picture again, this wonderful character. While telling the story with a great many more details than I gave you, Don Ubaldi would add, the gaucho cassock I had come to the Vatican with was a lot better than the one I had left home. As for my shoes, they were the only pair I had. Anyway, after the visit to the Pope, we went to the wardrobe to drop off our ferraiolos. The Monsignor told me that I could keep that cassock he had given me. It fitted me fine and gave me a thorough new look. I was no longer a gaucho. I wore it for several years and used to refer to it as my papal cassock. Well, it's a simple enough episode, but a revealing one. Instinctively we think of Father Alfonso's words we quoted this morning. In the early days of our society, we were poor. Our poverty was not just a vow, but a way of life. A Passionist once told me, "I get a feeling of despair when at a retreat for religious, I introduced the subject of poverty. I'll tell you why. 90% of us religious are just not poor, not as Jesus was poor, or even as most of the people at the service we are supposed to be are poor. We are often part of multinational organizations. We mostly live in comfortable houses without any problem of money, secure in our cozy little homes. We have no excuse for this, the Passionists continue. We know too that a comfortable life, not to say wealth, has had a painful influence on religious families. The first sign of any serious reform in the religious life of any order or congregation has always been a return to poverty and to the poor. Religious poverty in our Western world becomes a complex discourse. How can we practice poverty with all this wealth around us? We vow ourselves to poverty and then live considerably better and more secure than even the middle class people, let alone the poor. Does it make sense? Is there a point beyond which the vow of poverty becomes an illusion, a fraud? Why do we religious vow ourselves to poverty in the first place? Let's answer first the last of these questions. We vow ourselves to poverty simply because we chose to follow Jesus, who being rich became poor to enrich our poverty. In their usual direct and concise style, we just heard it, our Constitution's Article 81 make this crystal clear. They stress the point that from his followers Jesus demands poverty. He who does not renounce all he possesses cannot be my disciple. Article 81 touches on another point. Poverty denotes willingness on our part to trust ourselves solely and completely to God and not look for any security in the things of this world, so that the Lord truly becomes my portion. Finally, through poverty, we despoil ourselves of all earthly goods that we may the better serve the poor, exactly as Jesus did, who became poor to enrich us. All this is inspiring theory, but the practice. Article 83, we read that too, holds the answer. Let me just read the first paragraph again. Each one of us is responsible for his own life of poverty, living day by day the detachment he has promised. What an invitation to examine our conscience. Actually, when all is said and done, the mature and responsible Salesian will himself squarely face to the facts. The vow he made, the rule, Don Bosco's example. The good Salesian takes his cue from them. And most of all, he will often try to remind himself that he freely chose to follow Christ, who for his sake became poor. Now here is a question. Can I do this while I live in a comfortable house? When I eat 3 square meals a day, when all I have to do to get me a suit or a pair of shoes is ask for them? I can, and I must, if I want to be a religious. It would seem that Jesus had this in mind when he spoke of the 100-fold in this life. We are not to live in tatters. We are not to practice a poverty which we are trying to ourselves to erase from this world. It is not poverty, that kind of poverty without ourselves to. That would be misery. That is not what the Lord wanted from us. And notice this too. To some of his monks who thought the meals at the monastery were better than they had had outside the world, St. Bernard said, remember, you can be a glutton in front of a plate of beans, and you can practice both mortification and poverty in front of a roast chicken. We must be careful, though, not to push too far this roast chicken kind of mortification and poverty. For Don Bosco, poverty was a serious matter. He staked on it the fidelity to our Salesian vocation and the future itself of our society. As we take a long look at the way in which each of us practices poverty, we will do well to see if poverty is first of all in the heart, in our heart. Unless it is, we will never be truly poor. We will bear the name of being poor, but that's as far as our poverty will go. And have you noticed how the regulations, I'm not speaking of the constitutions, the regulations, Article 71, actually asks the community, both on its local and provincial level, to examine its collective conscience on the practice of poverty. Here the warning of Don Bosco hangs heavy, the day in which our congregation will open its door to wealth, ease, and comfort. It will have forfeited its very right to exist. Father Williams showed more than a little concern with our practice of poverty in this province. He writes in his report, one of the most worrying aspects in this area seems to me a growing insensitivity on the part of the confreres. And he insists that the scrutinum paupertatis, that collective examination of conscience about which the regulations speak, be made with earnestness and seriousness. I will tell you, in the community where I live in Turin, San Giovanni, there are about 26 confreres. It is sad, I say, that as we look around at one another, we find ourselves all old. Out of 26 confreres, I don't think there are 5 who are less than 60 years old. Well, that's in between parentheses. But let me tell you, that scrutinum paupertatis, that collective examination of conscience, takes a real meaning in that community. I was amazed, even to the point of actually quoting figures. Why did we spend so much more this month, or in the quarter, it's not every 4 months? Why did we spend so much more? Where did that money go? What did we spend it for? Was it necessary to buy a 5th car for the community? This was the last examination at which I happened to be present. And also, they usually figure out what the money saved of money that could have been saved, how much of it can go to that wonderful solidarity plan whereby poorer Salesians than we are can be helped. And speaking of searching our conscience, now and then memories come back that are just a delight. Many of us remember the incredible detailed examination of conscience we were subjected to many years ago at a monthly day of recollection. Some of us remember. It was especially so on the love of poverty. I recall in the early days at New Rochelle, we had a somewhat difficult prefect. God rest his soul. If I were to tell you some of the things that we were subjected to in the name of poverty, you would not believe it. Leave that aside. The prefect was then what you now call the economer. He would occasionally take over the examination of conscience himself. He would want himself to read it. And he would add some choice questions of his own. Have I been complaining about the food lately, specifically the dessert? Apples, apples, always apples. Exactly like that. And after a slight pause, he once added, what's wrong with apples? We should be grateful to Mr. Catalano, who donated to us a whole truckload of apples. And there were sighs and quiet groans all over, compressed. Another time he ad-libbed a good one. There were 2 bottles of mass wine in the sacristy. One disappeared. Did I take it? Well, let's face it. There are situations where the practice of poverty does not come easy. A true spirit of poverty, poverty in the heart, as we called it, is the one and only thing that can help us. As you probably know, forgive me if I sound so personal so many times. They say that I think I mentioned it. Old people like to talk about their past and about themselves. Well, there are situations where the practice of poverty does not come easy. We just said it. As you probably know, I travel extensively with permission. As vice president of the Holy Shroud Guild, I have a guild's credit card. When I first began to use it, I realized how easy it is to splash. Well, let me just say this. It is not, the religious does not need to have a credit card to splash. Who and what is to restrain us and to keep us within the bounds of our Salesian poverty? Only an abiding love, yes, a sense of loyalty to him whom I chose to follow on the day of my profession. In the end, it comes to that. A few months ago, I was at the Rome Central Station waiting to board the express for Turin. With me was Professor Luigi Gonella of the Turin Polytechnic Institute, who had supervised the tests on the Shroud in 1978. The professor is a member of the European Nuclear Commission on behalf of the Italian government. You would not believe it, but anyone and everyone in Italy connected with the government travels free, first class, on planes and trains. He and his cousins. Really so unbelievable. I wonder how they managed to survive. I mean, the state. I had a second or economy class ticket, honestly, I mean, but readily accepted to go with Professor Gonella. when he offered to pay the difference on my ticket. I must tell you that traveling first class on long-distance trains, European trains, can be a very pleasant experience. Anyway, we were just about to board the first-class coach when who comes in along but Cardinal Ballestrero, Archbishop of Turin, with whom Professor Gonella and I had frequent dealings because of the shroud. You might know that Cardinal Ballestrero, the Archbishop of Turin, is a Carmelite. In fact, he was Superior General of the Carmelite prior to his appointment as Archbishop of Turin. He looked at me and he said, these rich Salesians who travel first class, while we poor Carmelites must go second class. He could not help but notice that I was going into first class because we were just about to board the coach. Professor Gonella explained to him the situation and invited him to join us on the first class coach. Fine, the Cardinal replied. As long as you pay the difference on my second class ticket as you did for Father Rinaldi. And so we traveled very comfortably all the way to Turin. Now here is a cardinal who does not forget he is a religious. How many of us remember, always remember, that we are Salesians in matters of poverty? Father Binelli, with his inimitable sense of humor, used to say, there is an effective and fairly painless way to practice poverty. Accepting with grace whatever comes your way, and even if need be, learning to do without. Moving from a comfortable room to one less so does not need to be a tragedy, Father Binelli used to say. If today's meal is nothing to talk about, tomorrow's may be, we hope. He told me once, I lost track of how many times I moved from house to house. Listen, when he left the house of studies in Forlizzo, Don Bosco spoke to him. And he looked at him and he said, Francesco, you are going to need a lot of dictionaries. What did that mean? It dawned on him when they began to move him from one country to another. From Italy he went to France. He had to buy the French dictionary. From France he went to Hungary. He had to buy an Hungarian dictionary. He also had to buy an Austrian dictionary because Hungary and Austria, as you know, were united as a nation, but not as a language. And so he had novices on the boat. Then he had to buy the English dictionary when he was told to come to the United States. Don Bosco's prophecy came true. So he said, I lost track of how many times I moved from house to house. If the house I came to was beautiful, the quarters comfortable, the meals good, then I considered it a feast of first class. If it was not, then it was a feast of second class, but a feast it always was. You see, the saints. Now St. Paul says something very much along this line when he writes, I have learned how to cope with every circumstance, how to eat well or go hungry, how to be well provided or to be without. About comfortable quarters, something happened recently in Portchester. I have to tell it. Just before Easter, I got back from Italy to a very warm reception by the confreres of Corpus Christi in Portchester. Some of you do not know that I was there for 29 years. Father Masiello, the pastor, full of apology, because the room he gave me this time was not quite the kind he would have wanted to give me. And I assure you, it was comfortable, and I was perfectly happy with it. But my confrere near me, Father Duffy, did not seem happy that I was happy because he began to ask me to change my room, to go take his. It just happened that he had a suite, you know. He had a beautiful, beautiful place. And he said, I don't need all this room. I got 2 rooms here. Why do I have 2 rooms for? Besides, you need the telephone. You don't have a telephone in your room. I have the office downstairs. So what do I do with 2 rooms? I totally and completely said, don't do it. I come and go. I'll be away for weeks for the retreats. You are very comfortable there. Stay there, and I'm comfortable where I am. No. One day I was out for some lectures. I come home. What did he do? He moved a few things he had from his room to my room, and a few things I had in my room to that beautiful suite that had been his. And he literally pushed me inside. I said, now this is what you call marvelous. The spirit of poverty, the spirit of brotherly love, won a great victory at Corpus Christi. There you have it. But it's a wonderful feeling, I can assure you. And thank God we have not lost the beautiful feeling. Now, those of us who knew Father Binelli remember him best for his happy and carefree disposition. Because he was familiar with many languages, he was occasionally asked to go to the Westchester Detention House to help with confessions. Once, we were near Christmas. He came home minus his overcoat, his watch, and his wallet. It was not evidently a maximum security prison. He was very philosophical about it. He said one of those poor fellows decided to give himself a Christmas present. It gives me a chance to practice detachment. The watch and the overcoat were eventually recovered, but not the wallet. Well, he was a happy, wonderful man with a smile on his face, unforgettable. And this makes us think of St. Paul, who describes himself as overflowing with joy, speaking of all the privations, he numbered them. And then at the end he says, I am overflowing with joy. The truth is that the hardships of self-imposed poverty and detachment from material things cannot and do not, in fact, take the joy out of life. Not for a man whose mind and heart are fixed on the cross. We often speak about self-searching and examination. I did not provide a number of questions on poverty. I leave it up to you. It is again Father Binelli who at every exercise for a happy day wanted us to go over our belongings. What could we have? In our desk, in the little closet near our bed, to see if there was anything that was useless, and to get rid of it. He had a way of practically teaching us a lesson. Maybe we could do that. Look around our room and see how many useless things we have. Things that do not fit in with the spirit of the vow of poverty we have made. So you think about this. Remembering the words we read in the Constitution, each of us is responsible for his own life of poverty, living day by day the detachment he has promised. I feel bad that I put too many parentheses, but let's get down with obedience. I would simply say that a discourse on obedience would hardly be necessary if we take the words of Father Alfonso literally. We quoted him this morning. With regard to obedience, there is no problem. All we need to do is obey. The fact is that obedience in our day and age poses one of the gravest problems for the religious life. Am I exaggerating? In a recent survey of 3,458 male religious communities in Europe, on the question of authority and obedience, 97.5% of the religious who replied agreed, quote, in the church, authority derives from God, but is for the service of the community. But listen now, and don't be scandalized. Only 56% agreed the will of the superior represents the will of God. Only 56%. The other 44% claim that God manifests his will not through the superior, but through the community. The superior's task is simply to see that the will of the community be properly implemented. There is more to this surprising survey. For centuries, the superior juridically had the right to demand obedience and expected to be obeyed. The survey indicates that 83.6% of the religious surveyed felt that the subject has the right to discuss or dispute the order of the superior. 11.5% leave it to the subject to accept or refuse, and only 5.2% expect the order of the superior to be obeyed unconditionally. So evidently there are problems connected with obedience. How about us? What is Salesian obedience like? And our obedience, our constitutions are a monument of balanced wisdom. After the opening article that sets the why of obedience, based on the words and the example of Jesus, whom we freely chose to follow, Article 91 is very explicit on the style of Salesian obedience. We read that too. Obedience and authority are practiced in a family among us, where relationships are inspired by serene and mutual confidence. What Father Alfonso said, we quoted in this morning. Too many of us do not know what Salesian obedience is all about. And the same applies to the article on community obedience, that we form one community, that once something has been decided, it is for us all, not just to accept it, but to work, that it be implemented in the best way. Now we say, if all Salesian superiors were like Father Don Bosco, and all confreres were as observant as Don Rua, there would be no problem with constitutions like these. Unfortunately, it is not so. Don Caviglia, sharp-tongued as he was, used to say, listen, that if Don Bosco made a mistake, it was in thinking. All Salesian superiors would have been like he was. Quite a statement. Incidentally, Don Caviglia made this statement while preaching a retreat to directors and provincials, Director Major Don Ricaldone among them. Don Bosco did have problems, but knew how to handle them with a broad mind and a big heart. Surely in your Salesian readings you've come across the name of Giacomo Costamagna, the great Salesian bishop who followed in the trail of Cardinal Calliero, not only as a missionary, but as a distinguished musician. Do you let me 5 more minutes, please? Would you? And then I'll cut it, and we put the next to tomorrow morning. It's a little hot here today anyway. Listen, as a young priest, Costamagna was so in love with the oratory at Valdocco that when Don Bosco asked him to go to the school at Alassio on the Riviera to take over the music program, he squarely refused. Imagine refusing to go to Alassio on the Riviera. You should see that place. You should see it. And how far-minded Don Bosco was when he bought it. He bought stretches and stretches of beach on the shore. Unbelievable how the men looked ahead. The trouble is that following directors kept selling piece by piece all of those beaches until now they are reduced with a sizable piece of a private beach, but nothing like Don Bosco had bought. Well, anyway, Costamagna refused to go to the Riviera. He actually considered it an affront that Don Bosco, whom he loved dearly, should ask him to leave the oratory. For days he studiously avoided meeting Don Bosco. He even refused to reply to the written messages our founder slipped under his pillow in the cell in the boys' dormitory. Do you remember? You don't. The young ones don't know what the cells were like. One evening, Don Costamagna, in a black mood, decided to retire early. As he got to his cubbyhole, he was surprised to find Don Bosco. I had left the place in a mess, he said, recounting the story. The bed was unmade, books and papers thrown all over the place. And there was Don Bosco making my bed, a pillow in his hands. Giacomo, he said to me, I have no one else who could take over in Alassio. You know how important the music program is. You are the man for it. The only one who could do it justice in that important school. Take it at least for a while, and I promise you'll be back here at the oratory. I was so moved and embarrassed. I grabbed a pillow from him and said, Don Bosco, how can I say no to a mother? Only my mother ever made my bed. Maybe Don Caviglia was right. Don Bosco did indeed make the mistake of thinking that all Salesian superiors would be like him. In my 56 years as a Salesian, I had some splendid directors and even provincials, but none of them ever made my bed. Don Costamagna himself, I must say, and we'll stop here because it's becoming indecent now. It's way past the time. Don Costamagna himself seemed not to have profited very much by Don Bosco's example. All his life, even as a bishop, especially as a bishop, he was, to his own admission, an ogre, a bear. Not even Don Bosco succeeded to tame. And the story that follows is unbelievable. Maybe some of you heard it. We leave it for tomorrow morning. We hope it will be a little cooler. I would be taking too much of your goodness and patience to stretch this any longer. But the talk on obedience is truly important. In the light of that survey, and it was not a survey made by this grunt of religious, but by a commission of religious, you can begin to realize at what point religious life can be reduced if this all important vow should be discounted or should be lived as if it simply were not there. God help us and save us from such